any chance know the temperature of this evening?" She seemed somewhat startled. "Why, no, but I believe there's a thermometer mounted at— It's 35 degrees out, almost freezing and likely to get colder." She gave him a sullen look. "If you knew already, why bother asking?" He took another look at the boy before him. The child's nose was red and dripping with cold. "You have no right to lecture anyone on the care of animals," Robert said bitterly. "My cousin least of all." She frowned in confusion, and he left, his fist clenched. Behind him, the chants continued. "We're not animals. We're not animals." Sebastian was a tease. He could tweak a man to the verge of annoyance and beyond. But he'd never been so thoughtlessly, callously cruel as the woman was with her own child. It chafed at Robert that his cousin was judged in danger of losing his immortal soul when he wasn't the one rounding up children, treating them like cattle in order to score points. He was thankful to leave the crowd behind him. The interior was warmer and drier. When the doors closed behind them, they cut off most of the noise from outside. He found Miss Pursling in one of the back rows, seated next to the aisle alongside her friend. Oh, yeah. Her hands were clamped around the edges of her seat. He paused next to her. "Miss Pursling," he said, "we've seats up front if you and Miss Charringford wish to join us." "No, thank you." Her voice was cool. I do not care for crowds. If I'd known it would be this bad, I wouldn't have come. If there were any way to leave." Her lips pressed together. It was hard to judge the pallor of her skin in the faint light at the back of the room, but he thought she looked a little wan. Is it wan or wan? I don't know. "Are you well?" he asked. "It's nothing," she swallowed. "It's nothing. It's nothing. I'm nothing." "Your pardon?" She glanced at him and then swiftly away. "It's nothing," she repeated. "Please stop looking at me." He sat down in the row behind her. "There, I'm not looking. You have flowers on your gown." She did. Real ones at that. Little yellow ones edging her hem, her cuffs. They seemed appropriate in light of Mr. Malhour's work. He discusses plants, does he not? He does. And yet I seem to recall that he started with snapdragons, not— What are those? Pansies. There's a missed opportunity on your part. He glanced sidelong at her and caught a soft smile on her face. How many people glance sidelong? Okay, anyway. "They're lovely." "Ah!" She stared straight ahead. "There," he said in satisfaction. "Now you're breathing properly. You just needed a bit of distraction for a moment." He started to stand. "Your Grace?" "Yes." "Thank you." She was still staring ahead of her. She no longer clutched the seat as if it were the only thing keeping her erect. "I didn't really wear the flowers in honor of Mr. Malhour, Your Grace." He smiled. I know precisely who you wore them for." "You do? You wore them because you knew that color would soften the angles of your gown. They touch at the neckline, makes your eyes look like storm clouds. It's a lovely effect, Minnie. I know who you wore them for." She held perfectly still. "You wore them for you," he said. "Yay! Robert gets it. Good for you." She let out a breath. "You're a very dangerous man." He stood. "The hall is almost full. I'm sorry you'd rather stay here. I must go to the front and see my cousin. Shall I see you after?" The crowd." She looked around. "I may leave early, Your Grace, so as not to be caught in the throng." She looked into her lap as she spoke, but her face had begun to grow pale again. "You really aren't well." "It's nothing." She spoke more sharply this time, and a gentleman up front had stood and looked on the verge of introducing Sebastian. Robert had little choice but to leave her. By the time he found his seat, the man was running through Sebastian's history. "After a distinguished beginning at Cambridge," the man said, "Mr. Sebastian Malhour made a name for himself by—" Distinguished beginning? Ha! He'd scarcely made it through the first part of his tripos examination. He'd always been on the verge of being sent down, pulling prank after college boy prank. Nobody had been more shocked by Sebastian's sudden success than the old men who'd once administered at his exams. In some ways, Sebastian's subsequent success, the nature of it as well as the manner, was Sebastian's biggest prank at all. And he knew it. He came to the podium in front with a big out of a swagger and a smirk. Thank you all," he said, "for your very kind welcome." The quirk of his mouth was the only thing that acknowledged that half his welcomers had come to call him names. "I stand here to tell you about the science of inherited traits, the subject of years of study on my part. Over the course of my studies, I have come to several conclusions. One, that traits, like eye color, height, the number of petals on a flower, or the shape of a radish, are inherited from the progenitors according to strict, inviolable rules. Second, that the rules of inheritance appear to be constant from animal to plant, from vegetable to tree, from cats and sheep to goats, and, of course, the human animal. Oh, he was enjoying himself. There was a gleam in his eye as he spoke, a faint smile that spread at the indrawn gasps scattered around the hall. Third, I shall explain how the rules of inheritance walk hand in hand with Mr. Darwin's discovery on the origin of species. I know that many of you are particularly waiting for this portion, and so I shall explain the connection and the means by which I came to my conclusions using the tools of the devil, someone shouted in the back. Sebastian paused only briefly. Using facts, logic, and reproducible experiments, he said gently. All those may seem dull to many of you. My colleagues usually raise objection to proof by diabolical influence. There was another flicker of a smile, and then he swept his arms wide, striding to an easel he'd set up at the front. I start with the color of a snapdragon. He set his hand on the fabric covering the easel. At that moment, though, the back door of the hall flew open. Heads turned. For a moment there was only darkness. Then, "Get on!" someone shouted, and the goats that had once been in the square ambled into the hall. They looked about, mildly puzzled. "And you think there's no distinction between humans and animals," someone yelled. "But here's some for your audience." Titters arose. Sheep, Robert thought aimlessly, would have been a better choice. Sheeps were skittish things that bolted away at the flutter of a cloak. They would have panicked for an instant. Goats, on the other hand, goats saw a gathering of this many people as an opportunity. They walked down the aisle, heads bobbing. "I welcome all creatures intelligent enough to understand," Sebastian said grandly. "Never fear, my good man. I'm sure that after I'm finished, your animals will be able to explain the principles to you using very small words, the sort that even you might be able to comprehend." Another wave of laughter arose at that. The head goat took another lazy step forward. Then it stopped. It turned its head in contemplation, and reached out to take a bite from the flowers at Minnie's hem. Robert came half out of his seat, reaching back, even though she was yards away. She shoved at its head. He could see her lips move, see her slap it on the shoulder, but he couldn't hear what she said. "Here now," the driver shouted behind her. "Don't touch that animal. You heard that man. She's one of us. I'll have you up for assault if you lay hands on her again." He gave another belly laugh. Another one of the goats came up to her, stealthily reaching out its neck. Miss Pursling took a parasol from a nearby woman and whacked it. "Assault! Assault and battery!" Waves of laughter grew. Another whack with the parasol. Yet another goat joined the fray. This one reached in and chomped at her hem. Then blue fabric ripped. "No!" showing a hint of creamy petticoat. And that was what Robert realized was what was wrong. Nobody had moved to help her. They all surrounded her, watching, laughing. He found himself standing up, running down the aisle toward her. "Animal or human?" the goat owner was shouting. "Ah, you see, we can tell the difference after all." The people around her were laughing at that fool, holding back while Miss Pursling beat off the assault on her own. Robert shoved through the crowd, making his way up to the man. "You think that's assault?" he growled. "Oh, here we go." The man didn't look behind him to see who was speaking. "What?" Robert set his hand on one shoulder and forcibly turned the fellow around. "This," he said. "This is what a bloody assault looks like." So saying, he punched the man square in the jaw. "Yeah, Robert!" The fellow's eyes widened in surprise. He seemed to teeter in place for a bare moment. Then his eyes rolled up and he toppled over. Robert turned away. "For shame!" he snapped to the gathered crowd. "Shame on all of you! Get those goats off that woman! Now!" Minnie looked up at that. She'd been so busy fending off the goats that she hadn't noticed the crowd closing in on her. But instead of looking relieved at the men who advanced on the goats, her head whipped from side to side. She went absolutely white. Robert saw her eyes roll up in her head. If anyone had asked him before this night, he would have wagered good money that she had nerves of steel. He started through the crowd, but he was too late. She fainted in a crumpled heap before he could reach her. End of chapter. So that was the super emotional ending of chapter 14. Minnie gets punished whenever she does anything remotely for herself. That's what I got out of it. I don't know if you got that out of it. Anyway, watch the next one, which I will upload soon.